during the 4 decades that divided the globe, the Cold War wasn't just a matter of secret negotiations or United Nations debates. It unfolded in stadiums, icy rinks, hardwood courts, wrestling rings, and even on chessboards. Each competition carried a message. Every win became a symbol, and every loss served as a warning. This is a tale of queens and pawns maneuvered with geopolitical strategy, of basketball courts where talent clashed with ideology, of wrestlers whose bodies turned into stages for national pride, and of ice hockey games that felt like intense proxy battles fought on skates. And then there was 1980, the year the Olympic flame became a political battleground. Nations took sides, not through arms, but by choosing not to show up. That boycott echoed louder than any medal ceremony could. This is Enemies in the Arena. The first topic we got here, I'm going to be starting in chronological order. I'm starting on the 1972 basketball finals, Olympic finals between the USSR and the United States. So the 1972 Olympics, it was a really high-stakes matchup between the USSR and the U.S. The U.S. entered the game on like a really dominant streak. They had won 7 consecutive Olympic gold medals, so they're kind of going into this final hoping to get another gold medal. The game was really close from start to finish. They had a really intense emotion and pressure on both of the sides, as this was during the Cold War. They were trying to see who could come out on top and who was the dominant nation between the two. There was a Cold War hostility between the teams, which eventually boiled over mid-game. A fight broke out between 2 players, and it eventually led to an ejection of a Soviet player during a jump ball in the game. In the final minutes, there was 3 seconds left of the game, and the clock was reset 3 times, which were all in favor of the Soviet Union. The score at this time, it was 50-49. The U.S. was winning by 1 point. And eventually, as the clock was reset 3 times, all in favor of them, the Soviets ended up getting a basket, which led them to actually winning 50-51, which resulted in a deep tension between the 2 teams. So that was kind of like what a lot of historians say, but then there's also some quotes from players who were during that basketball game. So we got a quote from Mike Banton. He was from the 1972 Olympic finals. He played power forward and also center. So we got a quote for him which says, "We couldn't believe that they were giving them all these chances. It was like they were going to let them do it until they got it right." So this quote kind of shows like the significance during the game between the USSR and the United States, because it was obvious that like the refs were in favor of the USSR winning, and the clock resetting let them win, obviously. And then we had a response from Mike Bannon by Ivan Edesheko. He was the player who threw the game-winning pass to the USSR, who gave the winning assist. So he says, the American team was offended and it wasn't right. It was the Cold War. Americans, out of their own natural pride and love of country, didn't want to lose and admit loss. They didn't want to lose at anything, especially basketball. So Banton kind of comes back at Sheko, and he says, if we had gotten beat, I would have been proud to display my silver medal today, but we didn't get beat. We got cheated. So Ben and a lot of the other players who got that silver medal actually refused to accept their silver medal, and they actually are not letting their kids have it either, because they don't think they lost, they think they got cheated out of it. But that's all I got for the 1972 basketball finals.
Did you say it took place in Soviet Union? Where was that game played?
Yeah, it was in the Soviet Union. So yeah, it was in favor of them.
It's pretty interesting. There's so many events going on in 1972 with the Soviet Union, and when most people think of sports, they think of combat sports, basketball, baseball. But one thing that happened again in 1972 was the World Championship chess match between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky. And so this was a showdown between sort of the U.S. democracy side and communism, which kind of connects to the Cold War. These two central figures, 29-year-old American prodigy Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky, who was the reigning Soviet World Championship leader back in 1972. Fischer represented the individual genius, the American ideal of self-made talent, and Spassky represented the large machine that was the Soviet Union. And so with these two men, they were institutions, large superpowers like the Soviet Communist Party and the U.S. Party, which were backing these two individuals. And so what was really being fought over here wasn't really cash prize, a trophy. It was more of an ideological superiority. And so for decades, the Soviet Union dominated chess and used it as a proof that communism produced sharper minds and much more disciplined citizens. And so that's why Fischer's victory over Spassky in Iceland mattered so much. There was even a New York Times headline from September 1972, which says, headlined, "Fischer becomes king, ending 24 years of Soviet dominance." And many historians argued that the Soviet leadership saw chess as a field where it was pretty much unthinkable for Americans to win. Losing meant losing intellectual prestige. The tension continued even after the match, when Fischer tried to negotiate a title match with another Soviet champion, Anatoly Karpov. And the Communist Party refused. Pretty much they were afraid of Fischer winning and reclaiming the title once again and embarrassing the USSR. And so it's believed that the Soviets blocked the match for various political reasons, not just for the sake of championship. In the end, Fischer's win in 1972 became one of the rare moments where the U.S. beat the Soviets at their own game. So this makes lots of historical impact. And so this shows how historically important this event was with the Cold War, and it shows how culture, identity, and pretty much global battle for intellectual superiority. The Fischer-Spassky match reveals how even something as quiet and strategic as chess can become a large stand-in for, conflict. And it reminds us today, whether through sports, technology, even culture, nations can use sports as a competitive way to project power.
Moving to 1980, we saw how political messages could be sent by refusing to participate in sporting events. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979, the United States was searching for a response that would still signal strong disapproval without risking nuclear war. President Carter quickly turned to the Olympics, a global stage with immense symbolic weight. In January 1980, during a televised interview widely reported at the time, Carter said plainly that he would not support sending the U.S. team to Moscow if Soviet troops remained in Afghanistan. His message was direct. Participation would be seen as direct approval of Soviet aggression. In his State of the Union address that year, Carter made his message to the USSR even more clear. "I've notified the Olympic Committee," he said, "that with Soviet invading forces in Afghanistan, neither the American people nor I would support sending an American team to Moscow." The boycott eventually grew to include more than 60 countries. Some nations stayed home entirely. Others, like the UK and Australia, allowed athletes to choose for themselves whether to compete or not. The final number of absences made the message unmistakable. A number of states had aligned publicly against Soviet behavior, not through military action or sanctions, but by withdrawing from one of the most watched events in the world. For the athletes, the consequences were deeply personal. Historian Alan Gutman notes that the boycott turned athletes into pawns in the geopolitical game, and that sting has never fully faded. The U.S. government framed the sacrifice as part of a broader collective stand, framing the boycott as a moral responsibility. It revealed the way Cold War logic leaked into everyday institutions, including sport, and how governments saw athletes as representatives in an international struggle for ideological superiority between communism and capitalism. The Olympic boycotts reveal how deeply the Cold War shaped international sport. The Games became more than a set of sporting competitions. They became a stage on which ideological contestation played out through political gestures. As we've talked about through this conversation, sport became a political theater, a way to make geopolitical claims without the terrifying risks of escalation that lay beneath all Cold War conflict. By 1980, the Olympics weren't just games. They were a scoreboard for the Cold War. Historians have pointed out that the games became a proxy arena where capitalist and communist systems could trade wins without tanks or troops. Every medal was a political message. Every world record was an ideological victory. The U.S. didn't send troops to Afghanistan, but it did send a message through absence, a refusal to play a symbolic game. The boycott was supposed to pressure the Soviets, to rally allies, to demonstrate moral resolve, but it also revealed something more fragile. If sport was a substitute for violence, then stepping off the field meant losing one of the safest arenas for conflict the world had.
Another specific sports moment that resulted in a worldwide effect on the Cold War was the 1980 Miracle on Ice. This wasn't just a hockey game, it was a snapshot of a moment when sports, politics, and international tensions collided in a way that had a real effect on Cold War psychology. To understand why this game mattered so much, we have to start with the political climate of 1979 and early 1980. President Jimmy Carter had just announced that the United States would not send athletes to the Moscow Summer Olympics in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This decision wasn't isolated. Carter also imposed a series of economic penalties on the USSR. He restricted Soviet fishing permits in U.S. coastal waters, limited their access to American technology, cut down on agricultural products they could purchase, and even began aiding Afghan rebels in their fight against the Soviets. In other words, U.S.-Soviet relations were tense and getting worse by the day. And in the middle of all this, the Winter Olympics were to be set on U.S. soil in Lake Placid, New York. At that point, the Soviet Union had been the world's dominant hockey power for decades. They had won 4 consecutive Olympic gold medals, and they weren't just good, they were a machine. Their roster was the strongest professional team that trained year-round, played together full-time, and regularly beat NHL teams in exhibitions. The U.S. team, on the other hand, couldn't have been more different. It was made up entirely of college players, all of whom disliked each other from their intense collegiate rivalries. Herb Brooks, the coach, decided to schedule 60 exhibition games to try and mold them into a functioning unit. That last exhibition game, played before the Olympics, was a brutal 10-3 loss to the Soviets at Madison Square Garden, so expectations were very low. When the actual Olympic tournament began, the U.S. wasn't even considered a real medal contender. They entered the games as the 7th seed out of 12 teams. But surprisingly, they started to build up momentum, tying Sweden, then pulling up a major upset by beating Czechoslovakia, and following that with wins against Norway, Romania, and West Germany. That performance enough put them into the medal round, where they once again had to face the Soviet Union. And this is where the miracle happened. Against all logic, the U.S. team managed a comeback win, beating the Soviets 4-3. Although they still had to beat Finland to capture the gold medal, which they were able to do, the victory over the Soviet Union became the defining moment of the Games. For many Americans, that win actually mattered more than the gold medal itself. It symbolized something way bigger, the idea that the U.S. could still stand up to the Soviet Union at a moment when the country's morale was at rock bottom. To get a sense of how deeply this resonated, more than 36 million people tuned in to watch the game, breaking viewing records at the time, and globally, the moment had an impact. People everywhere saw this as an unlikely triumph over a seemingly impossible superpower. One of the players, Rob McClanahan, put it best. Reflecting on the mood of the country before the game, he said, "We were at an epic low point. Psychologically, moral-wise, just at an epic, epic low point. We were a bunch of young, upstart college athletes upending the Soviet machine. We were a breath of fresh air, and the psyche of the U.S. citizen immediately improved." What's funny, though, is that the players themselves never really saw it in the geopolitical terms at the time. To them, it was just about beating the unbeatable team. But for the American public, the timing couldn't have been more symbolic. Skyrocketing gas prices, the fear of communist expansion, the ongoing Iranian hostage crisis, and the lingering trauma of the Vietnam War had crushed American confidence. So a win, especially this win against the Soviets, felt like the first good news in years. Politically, it also fed into a shift in tone. Later that year, Ronald Reagan won the presidential election, campaigning on a much more aggressive, confrontational stance towards the Soviet Union. The Miracle on Ice didn't cause that shift, but it played into a growing sense that the United States could push back. On the Soviet side, the reaction was basically embarrassment mixed with denial. They downplayed the game in state media to avoid public humiliation, and the loss stung so bad that the players chose to not have their names inscribed on their silver medals. The moment also marked the beginning of a new era. Soviet players, slowly at first, began moving into the NHL, something that would have been unthinkable before.
All right, and mine was about boxing during the Cold War. So I got a little fun spin to our podcast here. We're going to be primarily discussing Rocky IV. So it is a movie about the Cold War taking place during the Cold War. So in 1985, the Rocky IV movie captures a fight between the American Rocky and Drago, the Soviet guy. So the fight itself is symbolic of the Cold War showdown. Rocky represents American grit and freedom, where Drago embodies Soviet collectivism and brute force. As Rocky absorbs punishment and refuses to quit, the film reinforces a key Cold War narrative. American strength comes from the individual spirit, not the state. When Rocky ultimately defeats Drago and wins over parts of the Soviet crowd, the movie imagines a softening of Cold War hostilities. It suggests that human connection and shared respect can transcend political divisions, a hopeful message released at a time when U.S.-Soviet tensions were beginning to thaw. In the end, Rocky IV isn't just a boxing movie, it's a Cold War text, a cinematic arena where two superpowers clash through the sport, and victory carries symbolic meaning beyond the ring. As seen in the movie, there's political pressures for both competitors, especially Drago, where he is constantly being threatened and stuff to win. Moving away from Rocky IV, another source I have is the Cold War's impact on the evolution of training theory in boxing, and essentially it's just going over the differences in the training methods between the Soviets and American boxers, where the Soviets invested heavily in scientific methods and U.S. boxing was more traditional, just brutish. And you can kind of see that inside Rocky as well when they're giving Drago, steroids and using these fancy machines to build strength, and then it's just Rocky running behind the car. So yeah.
It's I can kind of see the connection between like the chess during the Olympics and then boxing because there's a parallel with like that the Soviets are kind of looking into like more an intellectual way of and logical way of like going about their things. Like everyone believed like the Soviets were gonna win like all the chess matches, and then like in boxing the Soviets were thinking of it as more of a like a logical way, but like the U.S. was like all like just like strength ideas and then like using like steroids and machinery to kind of like help that. So there's a clear like distinction between like how those countries were going about that.
And that's the most interesting part of the war to me, is that the Cold War was a war of ideals in the end. And seeing throughout all of these sporting events, Miracle on Ice as well, where we saw the professional players for the Soviets versus the college players and the amateurs for the United States. I just think that reflecting the different ideals for running their countries also carried over to sporting events and how each country managed their teams. I think is very interesting to look at.
There's another interesting thing, I guess, going back to the Rocky movie, is you can kind of tell it's an American-made movie because of who the supposed good guys and bad guys are, and I guess it'd be interesting to look forward to in the future. Looking at like, because we see all these stories where it's like the Soviets using enhancements and cheating, but is that just because of our perspective as Americans, or what did it go both ways and we're just not going to hear about it?
And I think that takes us to the overall point of this podcast, where sport and then reflections of sport through Rocky IV were honestly one of the best forms of propaganda for both countries, as it was the clearest way to demonstrate their superiority over the